So this lesson comes from Chapter 6, Lesson 4. We're going to look at common denominators and equivalent fractions. So this would be when I would need this if I have a problem that looks like this. 2/3 plus 1/2. If I have a problem that has different denominators, I can't solve it until I have common denominators. So to do that, I'm going to find equivalent fractions. So this lesson will help me be able to solve a problem like this. So let's get started. First off, let's talk about the definitions of what a common denominator is and what an equivalent fraction is. So a common denominator is a common multiple of two fractions' denominators. And an equivalent fraction right here is fractions with different numerators and denominators are said to be equivalent if they represent the same proportion of the whole. So there are two ways to find a common denominator. So let's take a look. Way one, we're going to use the fractions 1/3 and 1/4. So if this was an addition or subtraction problem, I couldn't solve it because my denominators are totally different. I have a 3 and I have a 4. So in order to be able to add or subtract these two fractions, I need to get a common denominator. So there's two ways to do that. The first way, I could just multiply the denominators together. So I can say 3 times 4, and that equals 12. So because that is what I just solved, I can make that my new denominator. I can make this a 12. So 1/3 can equal something over 12. And then I can do 1/4 equals something over 12. So now to get that numerator, I need to figure out my equivalent fractions. So I'm asking myself, I did 3 times what number to get to 12? Well, I know that 3 times 4 equals 12. So what I do to the bottom, I need to do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm going to do 1 times 4 to give me my numerator, which is 4. So my equivalent fraction is 4/12. So 1/3 is the same thing as saying 4/12. Now we need to do the other side. So I have 4 as my denominator originally, and I've changed it to 12 as my new denominator. I'm looking for my new numerator. So I'm asking myself, 4 times what number gives me 12? Well, I know that 4 times 3 equals 12. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm going to do 1 times 3, and that equals 3. So my equivalent fraction to 1/4 is 3/12. So now if I was adding or subtracting, I could do 4/12 plus or minus, whatever the problem says, and 3/12. There's another way that I could find a common denominator, and that's by using the method, the lowest or least common denominator. So to find the least common denominator, I pull out just the denominators. So I pull out the 3, and I pull out the 4, and I make a list of all of the non-zero multiples. So when I say that, I'm just not doing 3 times 0. I'm going to start off with 3 times 1. I'm going to say 3 times 1 equals 3. 3 times 2 equals 6. 3 times 3 equals 9. 3 times 4 equals 12. 3 times 5 equals 15. I like to just go 5, and then if I need to go more, I can go more. So now I'm going to do the same thing to 4. I'm going to say 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 5 is 20. So now I'm going to look and see if I have any common multiples. I'm going to circle them. Well, I don't have a 3. No. Oh, 12 is common. So I'm going to circle that. But then I have no more other common multiples. So this is my lowest or least common denominator. If I had a number that was less than 12, that was the same in both 3 and 4's multiples, I would use that because you want to use the lowest number. So now I'm going to go back to kind of what I just did. I'm going to rewrite my fraction as 1/3 equals something over 12 because that's my new denominator. And I'm going to say 1/4 equals something over 12. And I'm doing the exact same thing as I did up top for way 1. I'm asking myself, how did I go from 3 to 12? 3 times what number equals 12? Well, I know that 3 times 4 equals 12. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to the top. So I'm going to multiply that by 4. So my new numerator is 4/12. Do the same thing down here. 4 times 3 equals 12. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to the top. And I'm saying 1 times 3 equals 3. So now if I were adding or subtracting, I could do 4/12 plus or minus whatever the problem says, 3/12 because they have the same denominator. Let's look at one more. I have the problem 2/9 and 1/6. I want to find the least common denominator or just a common denominator, and then find their equivalent fractions. So for way 1, we just multiply the denominators. So I'm just going to take the 9 and the 6, and I'm going to multiply them together. And 9 times 6 equals 54. So now I can make my new denominator 54. So I'm going to just put it right next to it. I'm going to say equals something over 54 equals something over 54. And that something, I'm looking for my new numerator. So now I'm asking myself, 9 times what number got me to 54? Well, 9 times 6 is 54. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to the top. So 2 times 6 is 12. So let's go over here. 1/6 equals what over 54? 6 times 9 gave me 54. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to the top. So 1 times 9 is 9. So if I were adding or subtracting these fractions, I would now use 12/54 and 9/54 because those are the equivalent fractions. Let's look at using the list, finding the LCD, the least common denominator. So I'm going to pull out my denominators, 9 and 6. And now I'm going to find all of the non-zero multiples. So I'm just not going to start off with 9 times 0 and 6 times 0. I'm going to start with 9 times 1. So 9 times 1 is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. 9 times 3 is 27. 9 times 4 is 36. 9 times 5 is 45. And I like to go to 5, multiplying by 5, because it gives me a chance to look at all the multiples. So now I do the same thing with the 6. 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times 4 is 24. 6 times 5 is 30. All right. So now I'm looking for common multiples, numbers that are the exact same in both lists, and I'm going to circle them. So I don't see anything yet. Oh, I see this 18 is the same in both. Now, if you see up here with way 1, I had a 54. If I would have kept going with my multiples, I would have gotten to 54. But that's not the least common denominator. That's just a common denominator. 18 would be my least common denominator. So if I'm going to find my new equivalent fractions, I'm saying 2/9 equals something over 18. And now I'm going to go back to the 1/6. The 1/6 equals something over 18. So the 18 came from my list, from finding the least common denominator, the common multiple. So now I'm asking myself, how did I go from 9 to 18? What did I multiply by? Well, I multiplied by 2. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to the top. So 2 times 2 is 4. So now my new equivalent fraction is 4/18. So now let's look at 1/6. How did I go from 6 to 18? Well, I multiplied that by 3. So what I do to the bottom, I do the exact same thing to my numerator. So I'm doing 1 times 3, and that gives me 3. So now if I were to add or subtract whatever the problem was calling for, I would use 4/18 and I would use 3/18 because those are my equivalent fractions that have a common denominator. And remember, you can't do anything with fractions until you have a common denominator.